dim corridors of time, before the hum of electric lights, before the sharp mint sting of modern toothpaste, there was a world lit only by fire. The year could be 1250 or 1420. The season could be winter or high summer, but the light was always the same amber, flickering, shifting over stone walls and wooden beams. Somewhere in this light, a face emerges. It is a face you might pass in a crowded medieval market or glimpse in the corner of a candlelit tavern, and then you notice the mouth. A smile, or what passes for one, spreads slowly across the face. The teeth are, well, teeth, but not like ours. Some are worn down to flat, pale stubs, as if the person has been chewing not food, but pebbles. Others are stained in shades of brown or gray, like oak leaves pressed in an old book. A few are missing entirely, leaving little dark spaces that tell their own quiet stories. It is not a perfect smile. And yet, here is the strange part. It is not entirely alien either. You might be tempted to think, as so many do, that medieval people had no interest in cleanliness, that they lived in a world where the mouth was left to its own devices until disease or age claimed it. That image is comfortable for us, a kind of historical superiority. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. People in the Middle Ages did care about their teeth. They cared enough to notice when breath was foul, when gums were sore, when chewing became painful. They cared enough to make powders and rinses, to chew certain leaves, to rub cloth against enamel in the hope of scraping away the day's residue. They cared, even if their knowledge of anatomy and hygiene was not what we have now. Consider for a moment the daily life of a person in that age. There are no plastic toothbrushes, no floss, no dentist with a clean white coat. But there is life in close quarters, the family sleeping together in the same room for warmth, the marketplace thronged with people leaning in to barter, the church where voices carry in hushed murmurs just inches apart. Breath is something that others can smell. Teeth are something that others can see. And for that reason alone, the medieval person had cause to keep them in decent order. The tools were primitive, yes, but not non-existent. A strip of linen, sometimes dipped in water, sometimes in a herbal infusion, could be wrapped around a finger and rubbed along the teeth. This was not daily for everyone, but for some, it was a routine perhaps done before a visit to court, before meeting a superior, or before a feast. Herbs like sage, rosemary, and mint were more than just flavorings for food. They were thought to sweeten the breath and bring health to the mouth. Chewing on them was both a pleasant habit and a mild form of cleaning. The beliefs about oral health were rooted in the medical thinking of the time, the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which were thought to govern the body. Bad breath was not merely a social embarrassment. It was a symptom, a warning of imbalance. Too much heat in the body, too much cold, too much moisture or dryness. All could be diagnosed by the breath and the state of the teeth. Thus, a mouth rinse could be more than cosmetic. It could be a form of preventive medicine. And then there were the powders. These might be made from crushed herbs, but also from more curious substances, ground charcoal, powdered salt, even crushed eggshells or bones, all thought to scour the teeth. The wealthy could afford powders perfumed with expensive spices like cinnamon or cloves, their sharpness masking odors and leaving a lingering warmth on the tongue. For the poor, such luxuries were out of reach, but ashes from the hearth, sieved fine, could serve in a similar way. Of course, not all mouths were well kept. For every person who took care to rinse and rub, there were others who did nothing at all, letting nature take its course. And nature, in a time before refined sugar, but with a diet often heavy in coarse bread and ale, had its own peculiar effects. Teeth wore down from the grit and ground flour. Cavities, though less common than in the sugar-saturated modern age, did exist. Infections could swell the gums and loosen teeth. And without intervention, pain could become a lifelong companion. When a toothache became unbearable, there were few remedies. Some would pray, others would seek the aid of a barber surgeon, who might pull the offending tooth in a public square, the act as much spectacle as service. But that is another chapter in this story. For now, in these early moments of our journey, we linger in the quiet. Domestic side of medieval oral care, the small, everyday acts that kept the mouth at least tolerable. It is strange to imagine, but if you could step back into a medieval kitchen, you might find a small pot on the shelf containing a mixture for the teeth. Perhaps it is a simple paste of salt and vinegar ready to be dabbed onto a cloth. Or perhaps it is more elaborate, a recipe handed down from an herbalist, containing sage leaves dried in the summer sun and pounded with a mortar, then mixed with honey. The smell would be earthy, faintly sweet, and somehow reassuring. These were not people entirely careless about their bodies. They bathed less often than we do, yes, but they valued cleanliness within the means of their time. The mouth, being both public and private, occupied an interesting place in their routine, not always tended, but never wholly forgotten. And so, when you picture the smile of a man standing at the edge of a medieval fair, or a woman leaning in to whisper a secret in the great hall of a castle, know that there is more to it than neglect. Behind that smile may lie a morning spent chewing mint, a linen cloth rubbed gently over enamel, a rinse with water drawn cool from a well. Behind it is an understanding, however imperfect, that the health of the mouth matters. As we begin our long walk through the centuries, we will see this truth take many forms, from the humblest cottage to the grandest court. We will find teeth polished with herbs, mouths rinsed with wine, gums soothed with honey, and, when all else failed, teeth pulled with iron forceps in the open air. But that is for later. For now, let the candlelight fade, and the smile of the dark ages linger in your mind. Imperfect, human, and not so far removed from your own as you might think. Morning in the medieval world arrived without alarm clocks, without the buzz of traffic, without the scent of brewing coffee drifting from a kitchen. Instead, it began with light, gray and pale in winter, gold and long in summer, filtering through shutters or cracks in the walls. For many, the first awareness was of cold, of the weight of rough blankets, of the nearness of other sleeping bodies, and then, inevitably, the taste of the mouth. It was a taste that could not be ignored, the faint sourness of the night, the dryness from breathing in cold air, the residue of whatever had been eaten last, perhaps ale-soaked bread, perhaps onions from the evening stew. In our modern world, we might recoil at the idea, but in the Middle Ages, this was normal, familiar, and shared. In a room where 5 or 6 people might sleep together, the mingling of morning breath was simply part of life. Still, not everyone accepted it passively. In some households, the day began with a ritual washing. Servants in noble homes brought basins of water, cool and often scented with crushed herbs, to their masters. These basins were intended for washing the face and hands. But for those with a mind toward freshness, the water might also be used to rinse the mouth. The process was simple. A cup handful swirled over the teeth and gums, then spat discreetly into the basin or onto the floor rushes. Herbs were a common addition to the morning rinse. Mint, rosemary, sage. These plants grew in kitchen gardens and were valued not only for their flavor in cooking, but for their medicinal and aromatic qualities. A sprig of rosemary might be steeped briefly in warm water to make a mild infusion. This was swished around the mouth, the flavor sharp and cleansing, believed to sweeten the breath and ward off illness. For the poor, who had no servant to bring scented water, the morning routine might take place at a communal well or a nearby stream. Cupping the hands, a villager could splash water into the mouth, spitting it back into the dust. The act is much about waking up as about cleanliness. In summer, this water was a welcome shock of coolness. In winter, it was an icy jolt that could make the teeth ache. Beyond rinsing, there were other habits that served the same purpose. Chewing herbs directly was common. A sprig of parsley, a few fennel seeds, or a leaf of mint could be crushed between the teeth, releasing oils that freshened the breath. Some even chewed cloves, though these were expensive and often reserved for the wealthy. The taste was strong, the sensation warming, and the effect, at least for a short while, was pleasant. There was no toothbrush, not yet. The first true brushes with bristles would come to Europe from China centuries later, but there were alternatives. One was the chewing stick, a slender twig from a fragrant or fibrous tree, sometimes with one end chewed until it became frayed, like a natural brush. Willow, hazel, and certain fruit woods were popular. Another was the linen cloth. A strip of fabric wrapped around the forefinger could be dipped in water, salt, or herbal powder and rubbed along the teeth. The motion scraped away food residue and polished the surface. In wealthier households, such cloths might be part of a small personal grooming kit, alongside combs, mirrors, and ear scoops. These kits could be kept in carved boxes or leather pouches, ready for travel. In humbler homes, a strip of worn linen from an old shirt served the same purpose. It's important to remember that in the medieval mind, the mouth was not just a place where food entered. It was also a site of diagnosis. Physicians, working within the framework of humoral theory, looked to the state of the tongue, gums, and breath for clues to a person's overall health. Morning breath, particularly if strong or sour, might be taken as evidence of a humoral imbalance, too much heat in the stomach, too much dryness in the body, or an excess of one of the other humors. Remedies for such imbalances could include dietary changes, herbal medicines, or even bloodletting, but in the meantime, a simple rinse or herbal chew could make daily life more tolerable. The association between breath and health was not entirely wrong. Though they knew nothing of bacteria, medieval people observed that foul breath sometimes accompanied fever, stomach trouble, or tooth decay. They also noticed that certain herbs seemed to help not just by masking odor, but by easing gum inflammation or calming the stomach. Mint and sage, for example, have mild antimicrobial properties, something medieval herbalists understood in their own way. For most people, however, the morning mouth was simply a fact of existence. They might rinse if water was handy, chew a herb if they had one, or simply get on with the day. The first meal, bread, cheese, ale, perhaps a bit of salted fish, would soon alter the taste of the mouth anyway. And so, in towns and villages, as people emerged from their homes to begin work, the air was thick, not with minty freshness, but with the earthy, mingled sense of humanity. Yet there was one more layer to the medieval morning routine, subtle but significant, the role of religion. Monks and nuns in monasteries observed strict schedules, rising early for prayer. In some orders, cleanliness was part of discipline. Monastic rules often prescribed washing upon waking before entering the chapel as a sign of respect for the sacred space. This washing could include the mouth, though not always with the intention of freshening breath, rather it was an act of purification. Imagine it, the cloister still dark before dawn, the sound of sandals on stone, the soft splash of water into a basin. A monk bends over, rinses his mouth, spits quietly into the drain. He might chew a sprig of something green from the herb garden, not to please others, but to present himself clean before God. Thus, even in the simplest act of rinsing the mouth in the morning, the medieval world combined the practical, the medical, and the spiritual. It was a world where the absence of toothbrushes did not mean the absence of care, where habits were shaped as much by belief and necessity as by the desire for comfort. Tomorrow would bring another morning, another rinse, another small, deliberate gesture toward keeping the mouth in order. In the grand sweep of medieval life, wars fought, cathedrals built, kings crowned, such gestures may seem trivial, but they are what make the past human, tangible, and in the quiet moments, not so very different from today. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your best hope for a clean mouth did not come from a shop, but from the garden, the forest, or the market stall where bundles of fragrant greenery hung drying in the air. Herbs were not merely flavorings for stews or remedies for fever. They were part of what might be called the herbal armory, a collection of plants and substances believed to defend the body, ward off illness, and, as a welcome side effect, keep the breath pleasant and the teeth bright. The medieval kitchen garden was a pharmacy in miniature. There, rows of sage stood with their gray-green leaves soft to the touch, rosemary grew in spiky, resin-scented clusters, and mint spread its runners greedily, filling the air with sharpness when crushed. These plants were familiar companions in daily life. They seasoned food, they healed wounds, and when chewed or brewed, they served the mouth. Sage was perhaps the most respected of all. There's an old saying, "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" The plant was believed to have life-prolonging qualities, and in matters of the mouth, it was valued for its ability to strengthen the gums and whiten the teeth. Leaves could be rubbed directly onto the teeth or dried, crushed into powder, and sprinkled onto a damp cloth for cleaning. Some even mixed sage powder with salt for extra abrasiveness. Rosemary, with its pine-like aroma, was thought to lift the spirits as well as cleanse the breath. It was often infused in wine or vinegar, creating a mouth rinse that combined fragrance with the mild antiseptic properties of alcohol or acid. To swish rosemary wine around the teeth was to participate in a ritual that was both medicinal and comforting, the warm liquid washing away the residue of the last meal. Mint, in its many varieties, was a more direct pleasure. Its coolness, when chewed, provided an immediate sense of freshness. In markets, bundles of mint could be bought cheaply, and in monasteries, it was planted near walkways so that its scent would rise when stepped upon, a kind of fragrant blessing for passers-by. In dental care, mint was sometimes pounded into a paste with honey, both to sweeten the mixture and to make it adhere better to the teeth during cleaning. There were other, less familiar herbs in the medieval dental arsenal. Hyssop, with its purple-blue flowers, was believed to purify the mouth and was recommended in some medical texts for loosening phlegm. Costly, beyond its culinary uses, was valued for its breath-freshening qualities, particularly after meals heavy with onions or garlic. Fennel seeds, chewed slowly, released a subtle anise-like flavor and were said to aid digestion as well as scent the breath. Not all remedies were strictly herbal. Powders were a favored method of cleaning, and these could be made from a variety of abrasive substances. Crushed eggshells, ground into a fine dust, were mixed with herbs for a whitening effect. Charcoal from the hearth, when ground and sifted, became a black powder that could scrub the teeth surprisingly well, though it left the mouth dark until rinsed. Salt, coarse or fine, was another common ingredient, sharp on the gums but effective in scraping away deposits. One popular recipe for a tooth powder might have included sage leaves dried in the sun, powdered salt, and a pinch of powdered clove. The mixture would be stored in a small pouch or jar, and when needed, a pinch would be taken out and rubbed onto the teeth with a damp cloth or fingertip. Another recipe from a 14th century manuscript advised mixing burnt alum with honey and rubbing it on the gums to strengthen them, though the taste would have been startling to modern sensibilities. For those who could afford it, exotic spices and imports expanded the herbal armory. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg came from distant lands and were treasured both for their rarity and for their potent aromas. These were sometimes ground into powders or steeped in liquids to make rinses. Clove oil, in particular, was valued for easing toothache, its numbing warmth applied directly to the offending tooth. The making of these remedies was often a domestic task, but it could also be a professional one. Apothecaries in towns stocked herbs and prepared mixtures, and barber surgeons might recommend particular powders or rinses as part of their services. Monastic infirmaries, too, kept stores of dried plants and recipes copied carefully into their herbals. And while we might imagine these remedies being used with regularity, in truth, the frequency varied widely. A wealthy lady preparing for a feast might take great care to chew mint leaves and polish her teeth with sage powder. A laborer in the fields, however, might only tend to his mouth when discomfort or occasion demanded it. The gap between ideal and practice was as wide then as it is now. Still, the herbal armory was more than superstition. Modern science confirms that many of these plants have antibacterial, antifungal, or anti-inflammatory properties. Sage, rosemary, and mint do indeed inhibit the growth of some harmful bacteria. Clove oil still appears in modern dental preparations for pain relief. Charcoal remains an ingredient in certain toothpastes, valued for its absorbent qualities. It is worth pausing to imagine the sensory experience of using these medieval remedies. The taste of sage powder, bitter, earthy, and slightly astringent, lingering on the tongue. The sharp, almost medicinal coolness of mint spreading through the mouth. The faint grit of charcoal against enamel, followed by the clean, almost metallic taste of salt. These were not sterile, factory-made sensations, but intimate encounters with the plants and minerals of the earth, transformed by human hands into tools for care. To us, the herbal armory might seem crude, but for the people of the Middle Ages, it was both familiar and essential. It was what stood between the mouth and the slow encroachment of decay. It was tradition, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, written in the margins of medical manuscripts traded between neighbors at the well. It was, in a world without dentists as we know them, the first and sometimes only line of defense. And so, in the quiet moments of the medieval morning or evening, someone might take up a small cloth, dip it into a jar of herbal powder, and tend to their teeth. The act was not always hurried. Sometimes it was done with the same care as mending a garment or preparing bread, a simple human ritual of maintenance. In this way, the herbal armory did more than clean. It connected the user to the cycles of planting and harvest, to the knowledge of elders, to the scents and tastes of the earth. It was, in its own humble way, a thread woven through the daily life of the Middle Ages, binding together health, habit, and the enduring desire to meet the world with a mouth that could smile without shame. In the quiet hum of medieval life, where much of the day was spent in the company of others, in market squares, in workshops, in churches, at the long tables of feasts, the breath was more than a personal matter. It was a social signal. It could mark you as clean and well-kept, or as careless, even unhealthy. And while the absence of a sharp mint scent might not offend medieval sensibilities as it would modern ones, the presence of something foul could not be ignored. Bad breath in the Middle Ages was often read not merely as unpleasant, but as a sign of disorder within. Physicians steeped in the theory of the four humors regarded it as evidence of imbalance, an excess of heat in the stomach, rotting food within, or even the beginnings of a more serious illness. This gave it a weight that was more than cosmetic. To sweeten the breath was, in a sense, to present oneself as healthy and whole. For the wealthy, particularly in the courts of kings and nobles, such matters were woven into the fabric of etiquette. Imagine the long, candlelit tables of a feast, where nobles sat elbow to elbow, leaning close to speak over the music and chatter. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the perfumes worn by those who could afford them. In this setting, a foul breath could be an unspoken mark against you, a small failing that might be noticed by a watchful courtier or a rival. And so, in such circles, care of the mouth became part of the daily ritual of presentation. Before entering the great hall, a noblewoman might chew fennel seeds or anise for freshness, letting their sweetness linger. A knight might rinse with a wine steeped in rosemary or cloves, not only for the taste, but for the subtle air of refinement it conveyed. These were small acts, but they signaled an attention to detail, a readiness to meet others in close quarters without offense. Among the middle classes, merchants, skilled craftsmen, and their families, similar habits took root, though often with more modest ingredients. A merchant preparing to meet clients might chew parsley, grown easily in a pot by the window. A guildmaster might keep a small pouch of fennel seeds in his purse to be used before gatherings. These acts were part of a shared understanding. When you conducted business face-to-face, your presence mattered as much as your wares. In more intimate settings, the mouth carried even greater importance. Courtship, in an age without the privacy of modern dating, often took place in small, charged moments, a conversation in a garden, a dance at a festival, a shared bench in the corner of a crowded hall. In such closeness, the breath was a messenger. Sweetness could suggest care and desirability. Sourness could speak of neglect or hardship. It is not hard to imagine a young man, hoping to impress, chewing mint before approaching the girl he admired, or a young woman, aware of her suitor's attention, quietly refreshing her mouth with a sip of herb-infused water. There is also evidence that certain remedies were thought to enhance not only the freshness of the breath, but the very allure of the person. Medieval love charms sometimes included instructions for mouth rinses made with exotic spices or rare herbs, the logic being that a pleasing scent would draw the beloved nearer. Whether these charms worked is another matter, but they show an awareness of the mouth as both a practical and symbolic site of attraction. It would be misleading, however, to imagine that all medieval people followed such habits. The rural poor, whose lives were defined by long days of labor, often had little time or means for such refinement. Breath was not something they sought to mask, unless perhaps for a festival or a church service. Still, even in these settings, there were moments when social signals mattered. A farmhand meeting the daughter of a neighboring family might chew on a sprig of mint before walking across the fields, not because it was custom, but because it felt right. In monasteries and convents, where the air was filled with the scent of incense and the murmur of prayers, cleanliness had a different meaning. Here, the mouth was not a tool of seduction or commerce, but of speech and song, for chanting psalms, for reading aloud the scriptures. Bad breath might be tolerated in the spirit of humility, but many monastic rules encourage some degree of personal care, especially before communal worship. Herbs from the monastery garden, sage, hyssop, mint, might be used in rinses, serving both spiritual discipline and practical need. There were also darker social signals bound up in the state of the mouth. Rotten teeth or a constant foul breath could mark someone as ill, perhaps even cursed. In an age when disease could devastate communities, such signs could provoke fear. Rumors might circulate that a person's bad breath came from sin, from demonic influence, or from a moral failing that had invited illness. Though physicians could offer natural explanations, superstition often ran alongside science, shaping how people viewed one another. It is worth noting, too, that the medieval diet played a part in these social perceptions. The strong flavors of garlic and onions, staples in many households, left their mark on the breath. Among the poor, this was normal and rarely remarked upon. But in higher social circles, where meals might be spiced with imported cinnamon or saffron instead, such flavors were less welcome in polite company. To carry the scent of garlic into a noble feast could be taken as a sign of rustic manners, a reminder of one's place in the social hierarchy. And yet, for all these differences, the underlying truth was shared. The breath, and by extension the mouth, was part of how you moved through the world. Whether in the refined air of a royal court or the open fields of a village festival, the way you smelled and presented yourself could influence how others received you. The medieval world was not silent on this matter. Medical texts, herbals, and even books of manners included advice on keeping the breath sweet and the teeth sound. Some were practical, chew this, rinse with that, while others were more poetic, likening a clean mouth to a garden in bloom or a fountain of fresh water. In these metaphors, the mouth was both a tool and a symbol, carrying the power of words, of song, of the kiss. As evening fell on a medieval town or castle, and people gathered in the warmth of hearths, these social signals continued to work in silence. A pleasant breath might encourage conversation, a foul one might shorten it. In love, in politics, and daily dealings, the herbal armory was not just about health, it was about being received well by the world. And so the next time you picture a medieval feast or festival, remember that somewhere, before the music began or the wine was poured, a man or woman was standing quietly in a corner, chewing mint or parsley, swirling rosemary wine in the mouth, preparing not only to speak, but to be heard and welcome. Toothache in the Middle Ages was not a minor inconvenience. It was a torment that could gnaw at a person's patience, ruin sleep, sour temper, and if it persisted, alter the shape of a life. There were no dentists as we know them, no quiet chair with bright light overhead, no numbing injections, no sterile steel tools. Pain in the mouth was a problem that had to be faced in other ways, through home remedies, through folk magic, through prayer, and, if all else failed, through the brutal certainty of extraction. It began as it still does today, a dull throb in the jaw, a sharp sting when chewing, a lingering ache after hot or cold food. Sometimes it was caused by decay, though medieval people did not think in terms of bacteria or acids. More often it was explained as an imbalance of the humors, or the result of excessive heat or cold in the body. In some cases, it was blamed on an entirely different culprit, the toothworm. The idea of the toothworm had deep roots, stretching back to ancient Mesopotamia. By the medieval period, it was widely believed that small worms lived inside the teeth, burrowing and gnawing, causing the pain. They were invisible most of the time, but when a tooth was split or extracted, some claimed to see them thin, wriggling threads emerging from the cavity. Modern science dismisses these sightings as the exposed nerves or fibers of decayed tissue, but to the medieval mind, they were proof enough. If worms were the cause, then remedies sought to kill or drive them out. One method involved holding a heated mixture of herbs, vinegar, and even strong-smelling resins close to the offending tooth, letting the fumes rise into the mouth. The heat and the pungent scent were thought to make the worm flee. Another remedy, described in some medieval medical texts, called for placing the root of a certain plant, often henbane or mandrake, directly against the tooth. Its poison said to kill the worm within. Other treatments relied on herbal pastes or poultices applied to the gums. Crushed garlic mixed with salt and wrapped in cloth might be bound against the jaw. The burn of the garlic was thought to draw out the source of pain. Clove oil, which does indeed have mild numbing properties, was sometimes pressed into the cavity of a tooth. Chewing willow bark, known for its salicin content, a chemical relative of aspirin, offered another form of relief, though the taste was bitter. Pain was not only a physical problem, it was also a spiritual one. In a deeply religious age, toothache could be seen as a trial sent by God, a test of patience, or a punishment for sin. Prayers to certain saints were believed to help. Saint Apollonia, a 3rd century Christian martyr who, according to legend, had her teeth violently broken during persecution, became the patron saint of dentistry. Small images of her were worn as charms, and her name invoked in moments of agony. Saint Apollonia, intercede for me and ease this pain. Folk remedies sometimes mingled Christian and pagan elements. A charm might involve reciting a prayer while circling a church 3 times, or carrying a small stone taken from the mouth of a dead animal. Some whispered spells over cups of water, then used that water to rinse the mouth. Whether or not such methods eased the pain, they gave the sufferer a sense of control, a small act to push back against the helplessness of relentless ache. When home and folk remedies failed, the last option was extraction. This was the domain of the barber surgeon, whose skills included cutting hair, bloodletting, lancing boils, and when required, pulling teeth. It was rarely done indoors. In market squares or fairs, the barber surgeon might set up a small stool and lay out his tools, iron forceps, pliers, or even a loop of string. Crowds gathered, partly to witness the spectacle and partly to confirm the skill of the man offering his services. There was no anesthesia. The patient sat, gripping the arms of the chair or the edge of their tunic, while the barber surgeon grasped the tooth and pulled with steady force. A crack, a cry, and the offending tooth was held up for the crowd to see, proof of the surgeon's success and the patient's ordeal. The wound might bleed freely. Sometimes the surgeon packed it with lint soaked in vinegar or wine to cleanse it. To us, the image is harsh, but to the medieval sufferer, it could also be a relief. The pain that had haunted them day and night was gone, replaced by a soreness that would heal. Yet extraction was not without risk. Infection could set in, sometimes spreading beyond the jaw, and in an age without antibiotics, this could be fatal. For that reason, many endured pain for weeks, months, even years, avoiding the surgeon's chair unless desperate. In wealthier households, there were more options. Physicians trained at universities might be called upon, bringing with them knowledge from classical texts by Galen and Avicenna. They might prescribe gentler treatments, rinses of warm wine, poultices of cooked leeks and honey, or elaborate herbal concoctions. Yet, even the learned physician could not perform the miracles we expect from dentistry today. The limits of the time were inescapable. Toothache, then, was a shadow in medieval life, a reminder of vulnerability, of the body's decay, of the thin line between health and suffering. It could sap a person's strength, change the tone of their speech, even alter their face as swelling and infection took hold. And yet, amid the pain, people sought ways to live. They chewed the herbs they knew, whispered the charms they had learned, prayed to saints, endured the surgeon's pull. In these acts, there is something familiar, the human desire to end pain, to find comfort, to believe that some remedy, whether of plant, prayer, or steel, will restore the quiet harmony of the body. That desire has not changed, even if our methods have. And so, when you picture a medieval street with its bustle of traders, children, and travelers, know that somewhere among them walked a man or woman with a toothache, jaw tight, eyes tired, clutching a pouch of cloves or a sprig of willow bark, hoping for relief. In the long story of human care for the mouth, their struggle is as much a part of the tale as the moments of cleanliness and freshness. In the medieval world, the table was not merely a place to eat. It was a stage on which the customs of a household, the wealth of a family, and the rhythms of daily life were displayed. It was here, in the company of others, that people not only nourished themselves, but also revealed the state of their manners, their health, and indirectly their teeth. Meals were social occasions, whether in the high halls of castles or in the low-beamed rooms of village cottages. They were times when people leaned close to speak, laughed with mouths open, tore bread with their hands, and shared drinking cups. In such intimacy, the condition of the mouth could not remain hidden. And so table rituals, though rarely described in terms of dental care, played a role in shaping how people tended to their teeth and breath. The food itself had a great influence. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, so essential that it was called the staff of life. But unlike the soft, refined loaves we know today, medieval bread was often coarse, dark, and gritty. Stone-ground flour contained small particles of the millstone itself, which over years of chewing wore down teeth to flat surfaces. To modern eyes, this wear might look alarming, but in fact it sometimes acted as a natural cleaning, scraping away buildup. Cheese, another staple, was eaten at many meals and had its own effect on the mouth. Firm, aged cheeses required strong chewing, which could help strengthen gums and jaws. Milk, when available, was valued for its nourishment, though it was not thought of in terms of tooth health as we understand it today. Vegetables, too, played their part. Raw onions and garlic were common in the diets of peasants, lending a pungent scent to the breath. Turnips, leeks, and cabbages were boiled into soft pottages, easy to eat even for those with missing teeth. In wealthier homes, herbs such as parsley, fennel, and mint might accompany these vegetables, offering a fresh note at the end of a meal. Meat was less frequent for the poor, but abundant for the rich. Roasts, pies, and stews filled the tables of the nobility, often seasoned with imported spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, whose scents could linger in the mouth. Spices were a sign of wealth, and to breathe out their aroma was to display status as much as taste. Sweets, though far less common than today, were not absent. Honey was the chief sweetener, stirred into drinks or drizzled over pastries. Sugar, imported at great cost from distant lands, appeared in the feasts of kings and princes. It was treated as a luxury medicine as much as a food, thought to warm the body and please the humors. Yet even in small quantities, sugar could contribute to decay, though the scale of its damage was far less than in our modern sugar-saturated diets. The structure of the meal encouraged certain habits that touched upon oral care. In many households, it was customary to wash the hands before eating, not just for cleanliness, but because most food was taken directly by hand. Bowls of scented water might be passed around, and it was not uncommon for people to rinse the mouth as well, especially at the tables of the wealthy. A quick swish of water or wine could dislodge bits of food, making speech and laughter more comfortable. At the end of the meal, another small ritual often took place, the offering of spices or comfits. Comfits were seeds, often fennel or anise, coated in sugar. They were both a treat and a digestive aid, thought to settle the stomach after a rich meal. The chewing of these seeds also served to refresh the breath. In some courts, spice plates were presented with pomp, and each guest took a portion to chew slowly, letting the flavors linger. In less grand settings, a sprig of parsley or a handful of mint leaves might be passed around. Guests chewed these not only for their taste, but because they left the mouth pleasantly scented. Even among the poor, herbs could be shared in this way, plucked from a nearby garden or from the wild. Table manners themselves had implications for the mouth. In polite company, it was considered poor form to speak with food in one's mouth, to spit openly, or to pick the teeth in an obvious way, yet picking the teeth was a recognized necessity. Small sticks, sometimes carved from wood or bone, were used discreetly to remove food lodged between teeth. In the grander halls, toothpicks might be made from precious metals. Tucked into personal grooming kits or worn as decorative pins, wine and ale, the common drinks of the age, also shaped the state of the mouth. Wine, with its acidity, could help in cleansing after a meal, especially when infused with herbs. Ale, though milder, was drunk in large quantities and could leave a film in the mouth that encouraged rinsing. In some regions, spiced wine, mulled with cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatics, served as both a drink and a post-meal refreshment for the breath. Feasts, with their long hours of eating and drinking, tested the endurance of both stomach and mouth. Between courses, servers might bring basins for washing hands and faces, and in refined households, scented cloths for dabbing the lips. These touches were not strictly about hygiene in our modern sense, but they helped maintain a sense of freshness and order. In village life, the rituals were simpler but no less meaningful. A shared pot of pottage might be eaten in silence after a long day's work, with little thought given to the breath. Yet even here, the end of a meal might bring a moment of care, the chewing of an herb, the sipping of water, the quiet use of a stick to pick the teeth. It was a small universal instinct, to leave the table feeling at least somewhat clean. And so, the medieval table, for all its differences from ours, played a role in oral care that was both subtle and constant. The textures of the food, the habit of rinsing, the sharing of herbs and spices, all of these shaped the health and appearance of the teeth. They were not deliberate dental practices as we would define them, but they formed a kind of background maintenance, woven into the act of eating itself. When you imagine such a table, the clatter of trenchers, the murmur of voices, the gleam of candlelight on cups, you can also imagine the small, unseen gestures, the discreet toothpick, the chew of parsley, the sip of rosemary wine. These were the quiet human moments that kept the mouth ready for the next conversation, the next smile, the next day. In the cloistered world of medieval monasteries and convents, life was ordered by the bell. Each chime marked a shift from prayer to work, from study to rest, from silence to song. Within this rhythm, there was little room for indulgence or vanity, yet the care of the body was not neglected. Cleanliness, in its own measured way, was part of the spiritual discipline. For monks and nuns, the mouth was not simply an instrument for eating. It was the vessel for chanting psalms, reciting prayers, reading aloud the sacred texts. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed in many monasteries throughout the Middle Ages, did not dwell on oral hygiene specifically, but it spoke often of moderation, order, and respect for the body as the servant of the soul. And in that spirit, tending to the mouth found its place. The day in a monastery often began well before dawn. The cold was sharp in the early hours, especially in stone-walled cloisters. Monks and nuns would rise from their narrow beds, wash their faces and hands in cold water drawn from cisterns or wells, and in some communities, rinse their mouths as well. This was not done for the sake of freshness alone. Purification before prayer was a long-standing practice, and the mouth, which would soon shape the words of the divine office, was as worthy of this cleansing as the hands or the brow. The water might be plain, but in many monasteries, herbs grew in the gardens for both medicinal and culinary use. Sage, rosemary, mint, hyssop, and fennel were planted in neat beds. Their leaves harvested not only for the kitchen, but for the infirmary. A monk preparing for the day might chew a sprig of mint to soothe the stomach and sweeten the breath, or rinse with rosemary water as a mild tonic. In some orders, hygiene was more than habit, it was codified. The Cistercians, known for their strictness, maintained rules about washing before meals and after certain tasks. Dominican friars, who moved between monastic life and the outside world, valued cleanliness as a sign of discipline and dignity when preaching among the laity. Nuns, too, often took care to present themselves with neatness, both as a sign of respect for their community and as a reflection of the order they sought to maintain in their souls. The act of eating in a monastery was itself surrounded by rituals that indirectly supported oral care. Meals were taken in silence, accompanied by the reading of sacred texts. Food was plain, often soft pottages, bread, vegetables, and on occasion, fish or cheese. Spices were rare, but herbs were plentiful, and their use in cooking meant that even a simple meal might end with flavors that freshened the mouth. After meals, monks and nuns were expected to rinse their mouths with water or wine, partly to aid digestion and partly to remove any residue. In wealthier abbeys, the water might be infused with herbs from the garden, especially in summer. In poorer houses, a simple rinse at a communal basin sufficed. These basins, often carved from stone, stood in cloister walkways or near the refectory, serving as both practical tools and symbols of shared discipline. The infirmary was another place where mouth care appeared in monastic life. Here, the knowledge of herbal remedies was at its richest. Monastic infirmarians, who tended to the sick and elderly members of the community, kept recipes for powders and rinses. Sage was used to strengthen the gums, rosemary to cleanse the breath, vinegar and wine to wash the mouth. Honey, with its soothing and antibacterial qualities, was sometimes applied directly to inflamed gums. For monks and nuns suffering toothache, remedies were much the same as outside the cloister, but often more carefully prepared. A paste of crushed cloves and honey might be pressed into the cavity of a tooth. Willow bark might be brewed into a tea for pain relief. In extreme cases, extraction was performed, though in many monasteries, this was left to a visiting surgeon rather than undertaken within the community. What is striking about monastic oral care is its integration into the broader philosophy of balance and restraint. There was no obsession with gleaming white teeth, no pursuit of beauty for its own sake. Instead, there was the quiet recognition that a healthy mouth served the work of the day. Chanting in the choir, speaking with clarity, reading without discomfort. To neglect the mouth was, in a way, to hinder the work given by God. Cleanliness also held a symbolic role in monastic life. Just as the body was washed before entering the chapel, so too was the soul to be kept free from the stains of sin. The washing of the mouth could be seen in this light, not as vanity, but as a small act of harmony between the physical and the spiritual. In the sermons and writings of the period, the mouth was often used as a metaphor. It could bless or curse, speak truth or falsehood, nourish the body or poison it. To keep it clean was both a literal and a moral act. Silence, a central part of monastic discipline, also shaped the experience of mouth care. In the lay world, one might chew herbs or rinse while chatting with others. In the cloister, these acts were performed quietly, mindfully, without the distraction of conversation. In this way, even a simple rinse of the mouth became part of the rhythm of contemplation. Visitors to monasteries sometimes remarked upon the neatness and order they found there, the well-kept gardens, the swept cloisters, the orderly rows of books in the scriptorium. This sense of order extended to the personal habits of the monks and nuns, including their appearance and cleanliness. It was a quiet witness to the belief that discipline in the smallest things reflected discipline in the greater. And so, in the stillness of a medieval abbey, the care of the mouth was neither hurried nor neglected. It was one more thread in the fabric of a life woven from prayer, labor, and learning. A sprig of sage chewed in the garden, a rinse of rosemary water before matins, a careful cleaning after the evening meal. These were small acts, repeated day after day, year after year, in service to both health and devotion. In this setting, the mouth was not a place of vanity, but a place of service, to sing, to speak truth, to praise. And perhaps it is here, in the discipline of the monastery, that we see most clearly the medieval belief that care for the body, rightly ordered, was care for the soul. If there was one place in the medieval world where the business of the mouth became a public event, it was the chair of the barber surgeon. These men, easily recognized by their red and white striped poles in later centuries, were the keepers of a curious profession, half barber, half medical practitioner, capable of trimming a beard, letting blood, lancing a boil, and when the need arose, pulling a tooth. The title surgeon in their name did not imply the precision and sterility we associate with the word today. In the Middle Ages, surgery was a rough craft, learned through apprenticeship and practice, not in the lecture halls of universities. Physicians, trained in the theory of medicine, often regarded surgery as a lower art, something done with hands rather than intellect. But when a tooth throbbed beyond endurance, it was the barber surgeon, not the physician, who provided relief. Their workplace varied. In towns, a barber surgeon might keep a small shop, a single room with a high-backed chair, a basin, and a table for tools. In villages, the same work might be done in the open air, under a canopy or at a fair. And in traveling markets, barber surgeons set up wherever the crowds were thickest, their services as much spectacle as medicine. The tools were simple but intimidating. Iron forceps, their jaws shaped to grip a tooth firmly. Pliers, not so different from those used in carpentry, but smaller. A dental key, a cruel device with a clawed end that could twist a tooth from its socket. Some relied on loops of cord, slipped around a tooth and yanked sharply. There were also small chisels and levers for loosening a stubborn root. None were clean by our standards. They were wiped with cloth, rinsed in water or wine and reused. The procedure itself was direct. The patient sat, sometimes in a chair, sometimes on a stool, sometimes simply standing. There was no anesthesia beyond the occasional strong drink taken beforehand. The barber surgeon examined the offending tooth, braced himself, and pulled. It was a moment of high drama, the patient gripping the chair, the crowd watching, a sudden sharp cry as the tooth came free. Blood flowed freely, sometimes splattering onto the surgeon's apron or the ground. The extracted tooth was often held aloft for all to see, proof of the work done, a token of victory over pain. Some barber surgeons kept the teeth they pulled, stringing them together as a sign of their skill. Others handed the tooth back to the patient, who might throw it away, bury it, or, in some cases, keep it as a grim reminder. The aftermath was not without risk. Without antiseptics, infections were common. A wound might swell, ooze, or grow hot to the touch. In severe cases, the infection could spread into the jaw or beyond, a condition sometimes fatal. Still, for many, the relief from the constant agony of toothache outweighed the danger. The atmosphere around the barber surgeon's chair was not always solemn. In the bustle of a fair, the act of tooth pulling could become part of the entertainment. A skilled surgeon might work quickly to the applause of onlookers. Musicians might play nearby. Hawkers sold food and drink within sight of the scene. In such moments, the removal of a tooth was less a private medical matter than a public performance, one more spectacle among jugglers, storytellers, and dancing bears. Yet, in quieter settings, the work could be somber. A farmer, unable to sleep for nights, might visit the barber surgeon in his shop, sitting down with weary resignation. A mother might bring her grown son, his jaw swollen, pleading for the pain to end. The extraction in these cases was a service not of showmanship but of mercy. The fees for such work varied. In towns, a tooth extraction might cost a few pence, more if the barber surgeon was known for his skill. In rural areas, payment might come in the form of food, drink, or other goods. The profession relied on reputation. A man who pulled teeth quickly and cleanly would find work easily, while one who broke teeth or caused great harm might find his business dwindling. Some barber surgeons were surprisingly knowledgeable about the mouth. They knew, for instance, that certain teeth were harder to pull than others, that swelling might make extraction more difficult, and that rinsing the mouth afterward could help in healing. They might offer herbal rinses, sage water, vinegar, or wine to clean the wound. Others, however, were less careful, working with speed rather than skill. The barber surgeon's role was not limited to extractions. They might file down a jagged tooth to prevent it cutting the tongue or scrape away visible buildup, an early form of scaling. They also treated wounds of the mouth, stitched cuts, and lanced abscesses. In all this, their approach was pragmatic, relieve the problem quickly with the tools at hand. In the lore of the Middle Ages, tooth pulling was sometimes surrounded by superstition. Some believed that a pulled tooth should be thrown over the roof of a house to prevent it from returning as a ghostly pain. Others buried it under a tree, believing this would ensure the new tooth, if one could grow, would be strong. These customs varied by region, blending ancient folk beliefs with the practical act of removal. It is tempting from our modern vantage to see the barber surgeon's chair as a place of brutality. And in truth, the work was painful, bloody, and without the safeguards we expect. But for those living in the constant shadow of toothache, it was also a place of hope. To walk away with the source of pain gone, even at the cost of a tooth, was a kind of liberation. The red and white pole, which would later become the symbol of barbers, had its origins in this mixed craft. The red represented blood, the white represented bandages, and the pole itself was said to recall the staff a patient might grip during bloodletting or extraction. In this way, even the sign outside the shop told the story. Here, hair could be cut, veins could be opened, and teeth could be freed. And so, In the streets of medieval towns, the barber surgeon's chair stood as a reminder of the rough practicality of the age. It was not a place of comfort, but of action, a place where pain met its match in iron and will. Those who sat there did so knowing they would cry out, bleed, and perhaps walk away missing a tooth, but also perhaps walk away in peace for the first time in weeks. In the medieval imagination, teeth were not merely functional tools for eating. They were objects steeped in meaning, woven into the threads of health, morality, and even destiny. A tooth could be a sign of strength or weakness, a token of beauty or a mark of decay, a relic to be treasured or a curse to be feared. In an age where the body was read as a book, every blemish, every ache, every feature telling a story, the teeth spoke their own language. To begin with, teeth were seen as part of the divine design of the body. Theologians and physicians alike believed that God had arranged the human form with purpose, each tooth placed in the mouth like stones in a wall. Strong, white, evenly set teeth were sometimes read as evidence of good health and moral order, a sign that the person's humors were balanced and their way of life moderate. Crooked, missing, or decayed teeth, by contrast, could be interpreted as a symptom of disorder, either physical or spiritual. There was also the belief that teeth revealed character. This idea, inherited in part from classical writers, suggested that a person's nature could be read in their face. A wide, toothy grin might be taken as a sign of foolishness or vanity. A tight, guarded mouth might be seen as prudent or secretive. In some moral treatises, the showing of teeth and laughter was cautioned against. Too much display could be rated as immodest, especially for women. In certain contexts, teeth carried associations with power and aggression. Warriors were praised for their wolf's bite or lion's jaws, metaphors that spoke both to their martial skill and their physical presence. Knights in romances sometimes had their teeth described in detail, gleaming, sharp, or strong, as if to suggest that their courage in battle extended into every part of their being. A broken tooth in such tales could symbolize a loss of honor or a wound to one's strength. Yet teeth were not only symbols of vitality, they were also mementos of mortality. When a tooth fell out, whether in youth or old age, it was a stark reminder that the body was subject to decay. For the elderly, the loss of teeth marked a change in diet, in speech, in appearance. It was an outward sign of the approach of life's winter. Medieval writers sometimes used toothlessness as a shorthand for old age, portraying the elderly as gumming their food or speaking with slurred words. Because they endured long after the flesh was gone, teeth also had a role in relic culture. Saints' teeth, preserved in reliquaries, were objects of veneration. Pilgrims traveled great distances to see or touch them, believing they carried the saint's holiness. In some cases, these teeth were displayed in churches, mounted in gold or silver and kissed by the faithful. The tooth of St. Apollonia, patroness of those suffering dental pain, was particularly prized. To possess such a relic was to hold a fragment of the sacred body, believed to carry intercessory power. Teeth, however, could also be feared. The same permanence that made them suitable for relics made them dangerous in certain strands of folklore. In some regions, it was believed that if a tooth was not disposed of properly, it could bring bad luck or even invite the return of the dead. Children's lost teeth might be buried under a tree, burned in the hearth, or thrown over the roof to prevent witches or spirits from using them. In Norse tradition, which lingered in some parts of medieval Europe, a child's tooth could be kept as a charm against harm in battle, a trace of pagan belief woven into Christian life. Dreams involving teeth were taken seriously. Medieval dream books, which interpreted the meaning of nocturnal visions, often devoted entire sections to the symbolism of teeth. To dream of losing a tooth could foretell the death of a relative. To dream of clean white teeth might predict prosperity or the return of good health. To see another's teeth in a dream could signal rivalry or conflict. These interpretations varied by region, but the underlying theme was consistent. Teeth were tied to the fortunes of the body and the household. There were also curious beliefs about the origin of teeth. In some folk traditions, a child's first teeth, the milk teeth, were gifts from the mother's blood, while the adult teeth came from the father's strength. This notion of parental contribution to the body reinforced the symbolic connection between teeth and inheritance, both physical and social. Strong teeth were a sign of strong bloodlines. In romance, literature, and poetry, teeth often became emblems of beauty. A lady's smile might be compared to pearls, ivory, or snow, materials prized for their whiteness and purity. This whiteness was not always literal. It was as much a literary ideal as a reality, but it reflected the aspiration toward clean, well-kept teeth, at least among the upper classes. The teeth of peasants and laborers were rarely described in such glowing terms, reflecting both social bias and the harder wear of life in the fields. At the other end of the spectrum, teeth could be used as symbols of menace or moral corruption. In religious imagery, the devil was sometimes shown with sharp, animal-like teeth, ready to devour souls. In depictions of hell, the damned might be bitten by demons, their own teeth gnashing in pain and rage. The gnashing of teeth itself became a biblical metaphor for suffering and eternal regret. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, as the Gospel of Matthew warned. Even in the law, teeth had symbolic weight. The phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, was well known, drawn from the Old Testament and interpreted in various ways by medieval jurists. It could be taken literally, as in certain legal codes where the breaking of a tooth was grounds for financial compensation, or it could be read figuratively, as a principle of proportional justice. In either case, the tooth stood as a tangible measure of injury and retribution. Thus, the medieval tooth was more than enamel and root. It was a vessel of meaning, carrying associations of health, beauty, strength, decay, holiness, danger, and fate. To lose a tooth was not merely to lose a piece of the body. It was to cross a threshold in the story of one's life. To keep a tooth, whether in the mouth or in a reliquary, was to hold something enduring in a world where so much passed away. And so, when a medieval man or woman smiled, their teeth spoke in ways both seen and unseen. They told of meals eaten, battles fought, prayers whispered, ages passed through. They were the white, or yellow, or brown, stones set in the arch of the mouth, marking time and meaning in equal measure. If you were to step into a medieval kitchen or apothecary's shop, past the baskets of dried herbs and the jars of powders, you might find tucked away a small bundle of papers or a bound manuscript, not a grand illuminated book for a cathedral, but a working collection of remedies and instructions. In its pages, alongside cures for fevers and ointments for wounds, you would sometimes discover recipes for the care of the teeth and the sweetening of the breath. These recipes were part science, part tradition, and part hopeful experimentation. Some came from the great medical authorities of the age, like Avicenna or Hildegard of Bingen, whose writings blended observation with humoral theory. Others were purely local, handed down through generations and recorded in a mix of Latin, vernacular tongues, and personal shorthand. Many were anonymous, copied and recopied without attribution, the wisdom of no single author but of countless hands. One of the simplest recipes called for sage leaves dried in the summer sun until crisp, then ground to a fine powder with a mortar and pestle. To this was added a pinch of salt, both for flavor and for its abrasive quality. The mixture was stored in a small cloth pouch or a lidded box. To use it, one would dip a damp cloth into the powder and rub it gently over the teeth, allowing the sage's bitter sharpness to mingle with the coarse grains of salt. This was said to make the teeth white and the gums sound. Another recipe, from a 14th century English manuscript, was more elaborate. It began with the burning of rosemary stems until they turned to white ash. This ash was sifted to remove any large particles, then mixed with crushed eggshells and powdered alum. A few drops of wine were added to form a paste, which could be spread on a cloth and applied to the teeth. The alum, though we now know it can be harsh, was believed to strengthen the gums and tighten loose teeth. The eggshells provided a gentle abrasive, while the rosemary offered both scent and cleansing. Some recipes leaned toward the sweet. Honey, prized for its medicinal qualities, appeared often. In one, honey was blended with powdered cinnamon and cloves to create a sticky, fragrant paste. This could be dabbed onto the teeth or gums, particularly before social occasions. The cloves numbed mild pain, the cinnamon masked odors, and the honey coated the mouth with a pleasant taste. In moderation, it may have been refreshing. In excess, of course, the sugar could feed decay, though medieval people did not yet understand this link. There were also mouth rinses, meant to be swished and spat. A common base was wine or vinegar, often warmed and infused with herbs. One recipe called for boiling mint, sage, and fennel in white wine, straining the liquid, and keeping it in a stoppered flask. This rinse was said to purify the mouth and give sweet breath. Another combined vinegar with hyssop and a pinch of rock salt, intended more for medicinal use than daily refreshment, and recommended for those with ill humors in the gums. Charcoal, too, found its way into medieval dental recipes. In some cases, twigs from fruit trees, apple, pear, or quince were charred, then ground into powder. This black powder was rubbed on the teeth with a cloth or a small brush made from frayed twigs. Charcoal's ability to absorb odors was valued, even if its staining appearance was less than attractive during use. A rinse of wine or water afterward returned the mouth to a more presentable state. One intriguing recipe from a French manuscript advised mixing ground coral with crushed pearls, musk, and rosewater to create a tooth powder fit for a queen. Such extravagance was far beyond the reach of common people, and even many nobles might never taste it. But its existence shows how oral care could cross from the realm of necessity into that of luxury, becoming a way to display wealth and refinement. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess and polymath, offered her own advice in her medical writings. She recommended rinsing with wine infused with parsley to strengthen the teeth, and chewing fennel seeds after meals to aid digestion and freshen the breath. She also cautioned against overindulgence in certain foods, noting that too much raw onion or garlic could cloud the purity of the breath, though she acknowledged their health benefits. Not all recipes were purely herbal or mineral. Some had an almost magical character, blending the physical with the symbolic. A 15th century Italian collection included a charm-like instruction to keep the teeth strong: grind together the dried skin of a valse head and a sprig of thyme, then rub the mixture onto the teeth at dawn while reciting a short prayer. Whether this was meant literally or as a metaphorical protection is unclear, but it reflects the mingling of superstition and medicine in the period. Even the method of application was part of the recipe. Some advised rubbing the mixture directly on the teeth with the finger. Others preferred a strip of cloth or the tip of a small stick softened by chewing. A few mentioned using the feather of a goose or swan as a makeshift brush, dipped in the paste and drawn across the teeth. These varied tools were as much a part of the tradition as the powders themselves. For the poor, elaborate recipes were out of reach. Their formulas were simple: ashes from the hearth, salt, a handful of fresh herbs when available. These might not whiten the teeth in the way of a noble's coral and rosewater powder, but they still followed the same principle: to clean, to freshen, to tend to the mouth as best as circumstances allowed. What is striking in all these recipes is the persistence of certain ingredients: sage, rosemary, mint, salt, wine, vinegar, honey. These were the staples found across regions and social classes, adapted to what each household could afford. Around them, the richer or rarer additions, pearls, coral, musk, were layered when means permitted. If you could walk through a medieval home as someone prepared their tooth powder, you would see a small, careful ritual: the measuring of herbs, the grinding in a mortar, the sifting through cloth, the storing in a clean pouch or jar. It was not so different from the way one might prepare a cherished spice blend or a medicinal salve. There was craft in it, and care, and the quiet satisfaction of readiness to meet a guest, to sit at table, to greet the day with a mouth made fresh. In the medieval world, a child's smile was not the unexamined image of innocence that it is today. A child's teeth, small and white in their first years, were the beginning of a long journey, a journey marked by superstition, hope, and sometimes hardship. The arrival, care, and eventual loss of those first teeth were watched closely, for in them lay both practical concerns and symbolic meaning. The very first teeth, the milk teeth, were a moment of great attention in infancy. Teething was understood to be a difficult and sometimes dangerous stage, not only for the discomfort it caused, but because it was thought to weaken the child's humors making them more vulnerable to illness. A baby's flushed cheeks, restless sleep, or sudden fevers were often blamed on the strain of new teeth pushing through the gums. Mothers, midwives, and nurses would gather their remedies, some practical, some born of deep tradition, to ease this passage. One common aid was the giving of something firm but gentle for the child to chew. In wealthier homes, this might be a carved piece of coral, believed not only to soothe sore gums but to ward off evil spirits. Coral was thought to have protective powers, and to place it in a child's mouth was to shield them as well as comfort them. In humbler households, a smooth stick of willow or apple wood might serve the same purpose, sometimes softened by boiling. Linen cloths, knotted at one end and dipped in cool water or wine, were also given to bite, offering both texture and mild relief. Herbs played their part here too. Sage leaves, warmed and applied to the gums, were thought to ease pain. Chamomile, steeped in water, could be given as a mild drink or used to moisten a cloth for rubbing the gums. Fennel seeds, ground and mixed with honey, might be placed on the gum line in tiny amounts, sweetening the taste and calming the child. Superstitions clustered around this tender stage of life. In some regions, it was believed that if a child's first tooth appeared in the upper jaw, it foretold misfortune, perhaps even early death. In others, it was considered a sign of great luck. The timing of teething could be read as an omen. A child who cut their first tooth before learning to crawl was said to grow into a restless, impatient adult. These beliefs were not universal, but they shaped the quiet conversations of mothers and grandmothers who watched each small white tooth emerge with both joy and a trace of anxiety. Once the milk teeth were in place, the question of care arose. Here, the medieval record is less direct. There are few explicit instructions for cleaning a child's teeth, perhaps because the work of daily life assumed it was folded into other habits. A cloth used to wipe a child's face might also be passed over the teeth. In households attentive to such matters, the same powders and rinses used by adults could be adapted for children, though often in milder form. The loss of milk teeth was another milestone. A gap-toothed smile in a child of 6 or 7 was common, and like teething, it carried its own customs. Many believed that a lost tooth must be disposed of carefully, lest it bring bad luck. Some buried the tooth in the garden, hoping the new one would grow as strong as a tree. Others threw it over the roof of the house, calling out a rhyme to a bird or spirit, asking for a better tooth in return. In parts of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, a child might offer their tooth to a mouse or rat, animals with strong teeth, in the hope of borrowing their strength. These rituals, though playful, reflected the deep-seated belief that the fate of the new teeth was tied to the treatment of the old. To simply discard a tooth carelessly was to risk inviting weakness or illness into the mouth. Even those who no longer believed in such outcomes often kept to the custom, as one keeps to a family tradition out of habit and affection. Adult teeth, when they began to come in, were watched with interest. Their alignment, color, and strength were thought to say much about the child's future health. A mouth full of strong, straight teeth was a blessing, suggesting robust humors and a well-fed body. Weak, spotted, or misshapen teeth might provoke worry, not only for the child's ability to eat and speak clearly, but for the health of their whole body. Medieval diets, especially for children in poorer families, were often heavy in coarse bread and pottages, with fewer soft or sweet foods than in our modern world. This meant that while decay from sugar was less common, wear on the teeth began early. Bits of grit from stone-ground flour could work between the teeth and into the gums, causing discomfort. Parents might respond with the simplest measures, rinsing the child's mouth with water, encouraging them to chew fresh herbs, or rubbing the gums with honey mixed with powdered sage. In wealthier families, the care of children's teeth could be surprisingly attentive. Manuscript recipes sometimes include gentle powders for the young, made from finely ground herbs and mild abrasives like chalk or eggshell. These were thought to strengthen and preserve the teeth, and though we now know they could not prevent all decay, they did at least provide a mild cleaning action. Religious belief, too, touched on children's teeth. The figure of Saint Apollonia was sometimes invoked by mothers when a child suffered severe teething pain or toothache, her intercessions sought with whispered prayers and small offerings. In some places, a child might be taken to a church to have holy water touched to their mouth in the hope of easing discomfort. The link between the spiritual and the physical was close, and care for the body was often folded into acts of faith. As children grew, the habits they learned at home set the pattern for their adult lives. A boy taught to chew parsley after a meal might carry that habit into manhood. A girl shown how to rub her teeth with a cloth might one day teach the same to her daughter. These small customs, passed from hand to hand, were the real foundation of medieval oral care, more than any written recipe, more than the tools of barber surgeons. And so the story of medieval children's teeth is not only about remedies and rituals. It is about the slow shaping of habits, the quiet transmission of knowledge through daily acts. It is about a mother watching the first tooth emerge and feeling both pride and worry about a child laughing with a gap in their smile, about the small ceremony of burying or tossing a tooth into the air. It is, in short, about the place where the practical and the symbolic meet, in the smallest bones the body makes, given up and grown anew. In the courts of medieval Europe, where every movement was watched and every word weighed, even the smallest detail of a ruler's presence carried meaning. Clothing, posture, the tone of a voice, all were tools of power. And among these subtler instruments was something less visible but no less influential, the breath. The royal mouth was not simply the organ of eating and speaking. It was a symbol of authority, a means of persuasion, a conduit for commands and oaths. Kings and queens spoke to ambassadors at close range, whispered to advisors in shadowed corridors, and addressed their people in great halls where the air was thick and still. In such proximity, the state of the breath could reinforce or undermine the impression a monarch wished to create. The upper classes of the medieval world had access to more refined oral care than most. This was partly a matter of wealth, the ability to purchase rare spices, imported herbs, and fine wines, and partly a matter of image. A ruler was expected to embody health, vigor, and divine favor, and a clean, fresh-smelling mouth was one small but telling sign of these qualities. Chronic foul breath, if noticed, could be read as a sign of illness, moral corruption, or even a curse. Records from royal households show that certain items were kept on hand specifically for the mouth. Bundles of imported cloves and cinnamon were stored in the spice rooms, along with nutmeg, cardamom, and pepper. These spices were valued not only for seasoning food but for freshening breath. A king might chew cloves before receiving foreign envoys, the warm aroma mingling with his words. A queen might sip spiced wine before a feast, ensuring her breath carried a trace of sweetness when she greeted her guests. In some courts, there was even a designated servant responsible for preparing these breath aids. This attendant might crush mint or sage in a mortar, steep rosemary in wine, or arrange a plate of comfits, fennel seeds or aniseed coated in sugar, to be offered discreetly after meals. In grand banquets, the presentation of such comfits was both a courtesy and a display of wealth. Sugar itself was an expensive import, and to use it for something as ephemeral as breath freshening spoke of abundance. Court physicians also played their part. Drawing on the works of Galen, Avicenna, and other authorities, they prescribed mouth rinses tailored to the humors of the royal patient. For a king with a hot constitution, a cooling rinse of violet water might be advised. For one with cold humors, a warming mixture of cinnamon and clove in wine. These preparations were as much about maintaining the balance of the body as they were about social impression. Royal etiquette demanded that rulers present themselves at their best in every public appearance. In diplomatic meetings, the breath could be as much a weapon as a sword, not because it could harm directly, but because it shaped the perception of the speaker. A fresh, fragrant breath suggested care, refinement, and discipline. A foul one could distract, offend, or give the impression of neglect. In an age when personal reputation was the foundation of political authority, such small matters could carry unexpected weight. Chronic bad breath in a ruler could become a subject of whispered court gossip. Medieval chronicles sometimes mention the health conditions of kings and queens, though rarely in detail. A monarch rumored to have an ill mouth might find their image subtly undermined by enemies. Such remarks could be woven into political insults, framed as observations about the ruler's humors, or hinted at in poetry and satire. In an environment where perception was reality, the scent of the breath could become a matter of state. The royal dining table itself encouraged care for the mouth. Feasts lasted for hours with many courses of heavily spiced dishes, sweetened wines, and rich meats. Between courses, servants offered hand-washing basins and sometimes scented waters for rinsing the mouth. In the more elaborate courts, guests might be given small bundles of herbs to chew, not only for their own benefit, but to ensure the air around the ruler remained pleasant. In certain ceremonies, the royal mouth took on a symbolic role. The kiss of peace exchanged between ruler and subject was a public gesture of reconciliation or alliance. The breath in such moments was not merely a personal matter. It became part of the ritual sensory reality. The same was true for the anointing of vassals, the swearing of oaths, and other acts that brought the ruler physically close to others. Historical anecdotes hint at the importance of this. One account tells of a 14th century French king who was known for carrying small bags of aromatic herbs in his goblet, pressing them to his lips before speaking in council. Another describes an English queen who favored rosewater rinses, both for their scent and their cooling effect on the mouth during long public ceremonies. Whether these habits were strictly necessary or partly ceremonial, they reinforced the impression of a ruler who was attentive to even the smallest aspects of their presentation. Yet it was not only rulers themselves who had to think of such things. Courtiers, ambassadors, and visiting dignitaries were also judged on their personal presence, including the state of their mouths. In this sense, the breath of kings was part of a wider culture of courtly self-presentation, a web of small, deliberate acts designed to smooth the friction of close interaction in an era before the privacy of modern space. There is something almost theatrical in this attention to detail. The medieval court was, in many ways, a stage, and every player, from the monarch to the lowest page, had a role to perform. The ruler's breath was one of the subtler stage effects, invisible, fleeting, but capable of shaping the audience's experience. It was a small thread in the tapestry of royal image-making, but one that could not be left to chance. And so, the breath of kings was tended as carefully as the crown was polished. In the chambers of the palace, herbs were steeped, spices ground, and sweetened seeds prepared. In the quiet moments before an audience or a feast, the ruler might pause to chew a clove, sip a rosemary infusion, or rinse with rosewater, not out of vanity alone, but as an act of diplomacy, an assertion of vitality, and a subtle declaration of order in the body and the realm. At the start of the medieval period, the mouths of Europeans were relatively spared from the rot that would come to haunt future generations. The diet, though coarse and often monotonous, was not heavily sweet. Bread, cheese, pottages, ale, and salted meats made up the meals of most people, and sweets, in the modern sense, were virtually unknown. Honey, when available, was the main sweetener, and even that was precious. But by the later Middle Ages, a change was beginning to creep silently into the kitchens of kings and the cellars of the wealthy, a change that would, quite literally, eat away at the smiles of Europe. That change was sugar. It arrived slowly at first, moving along trade routes that wound through the Islamic world, over land and sea, from India and the Arab world to the ports of Sicily, Venice, and Barcelona. Known at first more as a medicine than a food, sugar was prized by physicians for its warming quality. It was used to coat bitter herbs, to preserve fruits, and to make digestible syrups for the ailing. In apothecaries, it was kept in small, tight jars, weighed with care, and sold at high prices. But as the centuries wore on, particularly by the 13th and 14th centuries, sugar began to appear not just in medicine, but in kitchens. Especially in the courts of the wealthy, it was used to prepare elaborate dishes, candied fruits, sweetened almond pastes, and syrup-soaked fritters. It was still rare, still a mark of status, but its presence was growing. And with it came the slow, creeping enemy of enamel. The mouths of the medieval poor were often worn, teeth ground down by stone-gritted bread, cracked by hard nuts or age. But they were not, as a rule, riddled with cavities. Those belonged more and more to the mouths of the rich. The slow introduction of sugar into the daily life of the elite began to show its effects in a way no one yet fully understood. There are no dental records from the period as we would recognize them, but archaeological finds have begun to tell the tale. In burial sites of upper-class individuals, especially from the later Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, researchers have found teeth with deep caries, holes eaten into the structure by the acids that form when sugar meets the bacteria of the mouth. In skulls of nobility, the evidence of decay is more common than in the remains of farmers or laborers. This link between wealth and rotting teeth is one of the ironies of the age. For centuries, poor dental health has often been associated with poverty, but in the later medieval world, it was more frequently the reverse. To suffer toothaches and abscesses from decay was, in some strange way, to participate in privilege. Wealth meant access to sugar, but also to the spices that often accompanied it. Spices were not only used to flavor savory foods, they were blended with sugar to create sweets and drinks of startling complexity. A noble feast might end with comfits, fennel seeds or coriander wrapped in layers of sugar rolled into tiny beads. There were sugar sculptures, sugar paste figures, candied flowers, even entire table settings made of hardened sugar for display and occasional nibbling. These luxuries were delightful, but the medieval mouth was not prepared. Without an understanding of the causes of decay, or the means to fully prevent it, the damage accrued. Those who indulged in sweetmeats and spiced wine might find, over time, their gums swelling, their breath souring, and their nights interrupted by the slow, pulsing throb of a tooth gone bad. Still, the pleasure of sugar often outweighed the pain. A sweet dish at a feast was a mark of refinement, a message to guests that they were in the company of wealth and sophistication, even if it meant sore teeth, even if it hastened the loss of molars and canines. The indulgence was worth it, or at least that was the silent agreement of the court. Some efforts were made to counteract the effects. Rinses of vinegar or wine were common after meals, and comfits were sometimes chewed not only for taste, but to settle the stomach and clean the mouth. Tooth powders, as we've seen, included salt, herbs, and sometimes charcoal, which could scrub away residue, but there was no specific instruction to avoid sugar. The connection had not yet been made. Interestingly, some religious writers began to speak of sweets in moral terms. Too much sweetness was associated with softness of the spirit, with gluttony, with luxury and decay, both physical and moral. A monk might write of sugar as a temptation not only for the tongue, but for the soul. These warnings, though not framed in dental terms, echo strangely with our modern understanding. In popular culture, too, the symbolism began to shift. The white teeth of the youthful peasant became a symbol of natural health and vigor, while the blackened or missing teeth of the nobility hinted at indulgence and moral decline. Of course, these images were not universal, but the seeds of association had been planted. By the end of the medieval period, sugar was no longer confined to medicine. It had moved fully into the kitchens and pantries of the rich, and would eventually spread more widely as European powers expanded their reach into sugar-producing regions in the centuries to follow. What had begun as a rare spice had become a staple of sweetness, and the decay it caused was no longer confined to the privileged. In this shift, the mouth became the battleground of pleasure and consequence. The white gleam of sugared teeth dulled, the breath soured, the nerves began to ache. But still, the hand reached for the next comfit, the next spiced cake, the next sweet sip of syruped wine. And so, behind the velvet curtains of the feast hall, as music played and laughter rang out, another sound quietly took root, the crunch of crumbling enamel, the hiss of an aching nerve, the slow erosion of the smile. The medieval world, though often imagined as closed and insular, was in truth threaded through with roots of trade, pilgrimage, and conquest that carried not only goods but ideas, habits, and tools. In the realm of oral care, as in so many other aspects of life, Europe absorbed, adapted, and sometimes forgot the knowledge brought by contact with distant lands. Some of these influences reached Europe by way of the Crusades, the armies and pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land. In the 11th through 13th centuries did not only encounter new landscapes and peoples, they also encountered new customs of hygiene. In the bustling cities of the Levant, Public baths and markets offered items unfamiliar to most Europeans: fragrant oils, herbal pastes, and small sticks for cleaning the teeth. These sticks, known in the Islamic world as miswaks, were cut from the twigs and roots of certain trees, especially the Salvadora persica. Their ends were chewed until the fibers spread, forming a natural brush. Not only did they physically remove food and plaque, but the wood contained compounds that freshened the breath and inhibited bacterial growth. Muslim travelers and scholars praised the miswak as both a hygienic and religious practice, recommended by the Prophet Muhammad himself. Crusaders and merchants sometimes brought them back to Europe, where they were regarded as curious and exotic. Yet, for reasons of habit and perhaps cultural pride, these tools did not take firm root in most of Europe. The linen cloth and herbal powder remained dominant, while the chewing stick became only an occasional curiosity among the wealthy or well-traveled. Still, the idea of using a specialized tool for the teeth may have quietly planted seeds that would later, centuries on, flower into the toothbrushes of the early modern era. Trade with the Islamic world also reintroduced certain substances known to the ancients, but largely forgotten in the West. One was natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, used by the ancient Egyptians for cleaning the body and preserving the dead. In small amounts, it made an effective tooth powder, abrasive yet gentle. Through the busy Mediterranean ports, natron found its way once again into some European recipes for dental care. Though it never became common among the poor, from Byzantium came other echoes of Roman practice. The Byzantines had preserved much of the medical knowledge of antiquity, including recipes for tooth powders and mouth rinses from authors like Dioscorides and Galen. These often included ingredients such as myrrh, frankincense, and aloe, fragrant resins and plant extracts that were traded across the eastern Mediterranean. Myrrh, in particular, was valued for its astringent and antiseptic qualities, and small quantities appear in medieval European medicinal texts as an ingredient for gum health. Contact with the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, through both war and the travels of merchants like Marco Polo, brought knowledge from even further east. The Chinese had used bristle brushes for centuries, their handles carved from bamboo or bone, and their bristles taken from the stiff hair of pigs or horses. These were not immediately adopted in Europe, but accounts of them filtered back, sometimes mingled with tales of other marvels. In time, the idea would be revived, but in the high medieval period, it was simply another detail in the long list of Eastern wonders. There were also influences from closer to home, practices remembered from the Roman era, surviving in pockets and often blended with newer medieval habits. In some rural areas of Italy and southern France, people still chewed certain aromatic twigs as the Romans had done, sometimes from olive or fig trees. In other regions, ashes from specific plants were prized for tooth powders, recalling old formulas from Latin texts. Yet, just as some practices were revived, others slipped into obscurity. The Roman fondness for rinsing the mouth with seawater, for instance, faded in most of medieval Europe, perhaps because of the inland focus of much of the population. The use of pumice stone, ground fine and mixed into powders, was also less common than in the classical age, replaced by eggshells, salt, or charcoal. It is tempting to imagine what might have been if Europe had more fully embraced the tools and techniques of its neighbors. Would the widespread use of miswak have slowed the spread of decay among the wealthy as sugar consumption rose? Would bristle brushes have entered common use centuries earlier? History offers no clear answer. But the ebb and flow of ideas shows how oral care, like so many aspects of medieval life, was shaped by the currents of contact and separation. Pilgrimage, too, played its role in this exchange. Pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Canterbury, or Jerusalem carried not only prayers and relics, but small souvenirs, including herbs, oils, or powders encountered along the way. A pilgrim who tasted a rosemary rinse in Italy might bring the recipe home to England. One who chewed a resin gum in North Africa might share it in a French tavern. These were small transmissions, often undocumented, yet they added texture to the patchwork of medieval habits. Some of the more exotic imports became status symbols. A lord returning from the east, with a small pouch of clove-scented tooth powder could impress guests with both the fragrance and the story of its origin. A lady displaying a silver-mounted stick for cleaning her teeth could hint at connections far beyond her own lands. In this way, oral care itself became one more arena for the performance of wealth, learning, and worldliness. But for every foreign influence that was adopted, there were many that faded after a brief moment of curiosity. Europe in the Middle Ages, though connected to the wider world, was also deeply attached to its own traditions. The comfort of the familiar linen cloth, the scent of native sage and mint, the recipes passed down from mother to daughter, these often outweighed the allure of unfamiliar methods, however effective they might have been elsewhere. Thus, the story of foreign influences on medieval oral care is one of both enrichment and forgetting. Ideas arrived, sometimes took root, sometimes withered. A few persisted quietly, folded into local customs until their origins were forgotten. Others vanished, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later and hailed as innovations. And so, in the ports and palaces, in the tents of crusaders and the cloisters of pilgrims, small acts of mouth care crossed borders, mingled with local ways, and left faint traces in the daily lives of people who never thought of themselves as part of a global exchange, but whose smiles, however imperfect, were shaped by it nonetheless. The medieval world, though often imagined as closed and insular, was in truth threaded through with roots of trade, pilgrimage, and conquest that carried not only goods but ideas, habits, and tools. In the realm of oral care, as in so many other aspects of life, Europe absorbed, adapted, and sometimes forgot the knowledge brought by contact with distant lands. Some of these influences reached Europe by way of the Crusades, the armies and pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land. In the 11th through 13th centuries did not only encounter new landscapes and peoples, they also encountered new customs of hygiene. In the bustling cities of the Levant, public baths and markets offered items unfamiliar to most Europeans: fragrant oils, herbal pastes, and small sticks for cleaning the teeth. These sticks, known in the Islamic world as miswaks, were cut from the twigs and roots of certain trees, especially the Salvadora persica. Their ends were chewed until the fiber spread, forming a natural brush. Not only did they physically remove food and plaque, but the wood contained compounds that freshened the breath and inhibited bacterial growth. Muslim travelers and scholars praised the miswak as both a hygienic and religious practice, recommended by the Prophet Muhammad himself. Crusaders and merchants sometimes brought them back to Europe, where they were regarded as curious and exotic. Yet, for reasons of habit and perhaps cultural pride, these tools did not take firm root in most of Europe. The linen cloth and herbal powder remained dominant, while the chewing stick became only an occasional curiosity among the wealthy or well-traveled. Still, the idea of using a specialized tool for the teeth may have quietly planted seeds that would later, centuries on, flower into the toothbrushes of the early modern era. Trade with the Islamic world also reintroduced certain substances known to the ancients, but largely forgotten in the West. One was natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, used by the ancient Egyptians for cleaning the body and preserving the dead. In small amounts, it made an effective tooth powder, abrasive yet gentle. Through the busy Mediterranean ports, natron found its way once again into some European recipes for dental care. Though it never became common among the poor, from Byzantium came other echoes of Roman practice. The Byzantines had preserved much of the medical knowledge of antiquity, including recipes for tooth powders and mouth rinses from authors like Dioscorides and Galen. These often included ingredients such as myrrh, frankincense, and aloe, fragrant resins and plant extracts that were traded across the eastern Mediterranean. Myrrh, in particular, was valued for its astringent and antiseptic qualities, and small quantities appear in medieval European medicinal texts as an ingredient for gum health. Contact with the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, through both war and the travels of merchants like Marco Polo, brought knowledge from even further east. The Chinese had used bristle brushes for centuries, their handles carved from bamboo or bone, and their bristles taken from the stiff hair of pigs or horses. These were not immediately adopted in Europe, but accounts of them filtered back, sometimes mingled with tales of other marvels. In time, the idea would be revived, but in the high medieval period, it was simply another detail in the long list of Eastern wonders. There were also influences from closer to home, practices remembered from the Roman era, surviving in pockets and often blended with newer medieval habits. In some rural areas of Italy and southern France, people still chewed certain aromatic twigs as the Romans had done, sometimes from olive or fig trees. In other regions, ashes from specific plants were prized for tooth powders, recalling old formulas from Latin texts. Yet, just as some practices were revived, others slipped into obscurity. The Roman fondness for rinsing the mouth with seawater, for instance, faded in most of medieval Europe, perhaps because of the inland focus of much of the population. The use of pumice stone, ground fine and mixed into powders, was also less common than in the classical age, replaced by eggshells, salt, or charcoal. It is tempting to imagine what might have been if Europe had more fully embraced the tools and techniques of its neighbors. Would the widespread use of miswak have slowed the spread of decay among the wealthy as sugar consumption rose? Would bristle brushes have entered common use centuries earlier? History offers no clear answer, but the ebb and flow of ideas shows how oral care, like so many aspects of medieval life, was shaped by the currents of contact and separation. Pilgrimage, too, played its role in this exchange. Pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Canterbury, or Jerusalem carried not only prayers and relics, but small souvenirs, including herbs, oils, or powders encountered along the way. A pilgrim who tasted a rosemary rinse in Italy might bring the recipe home to England. One who chewed a resin gum in North Africa might share it in a French tavern. These were small transmissions, often undocumented, yet they added texture to the patchwork of medieval habits. Some of the more exotic imports became status symbols. A lord returning from the east, with a small pouch of clove-scented tooth powder, could impress guests with both the fragrance and the story of its origin. A lady displaying a silver-mounted stick for cleaning her teeth could hint at connections far beyond her own lands. In this way, oral care itself became one more arena for the performance of wealth, learning, and worldliness. But for every foreign influence that was adopted, there were many that faded after a brief moment of curiosity. Europe in the Middle Ages, though connected to the wider world, was also deeply attached to its own traditions. The comfort of the familiar linen cloth, the scent of native sage and mint, the recipes passed down from mother to daughter, these often outweighed the allure of unfamiliar methods, however effective they might have been elsewhere. Thus, the story of foreign influences on medieval oral care is one of both enrichment and forgetting. Ideas arrived, sometimes took root, sometimes withered. A few persisted quietly, folded into local customs until their origins were forgotten. Others vanished, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later and hailed as innovations. And so, in the ports and palaces, in the tents of crusaders and the cloisters of pilgrims, small acts of mouth care crossed borders, mingled with local ways, and left faint traces in the daily lives of people who never thought of themselves as part of a global exchange, but whose smiles, however imperfect, were shaped by it nonetheless. In the softer light of medieval life, in gardens and quiet chambers, beneath balconies in the evening, the mouth was not a battlefield of toothache or a fortress against disease, but the site of gentler pursuits, love, song, and the weaving of words meant to charm. Here, the mouth was an ornament, a focus, a promise. Poets of the Middle Ages lingered over mouths as painters lingered over light. Troubadours in the south of France, singing their verses of Fenimore, often praised the lips of their beloved, likening them to roses newly opened or coral newly polished. The teeth, when they were mentioned, were pearls or ivory, not imprecise dental detail, but as shimmering symbols of purity and allure. The breath, too, was a part of this idealized portrait, imagined as sweet with the scent of herbs, wine, or honey. In courtly love poetry, the mouth was not simply a feature. It was the gate through which desire passed. It spoke words of kindness or cruelty. It smiled encouragement or withheld it. It gave or denied the kiss. A kiss in these songs was often the pinnacle of romance, not merely a physical act, but a union of breath, a mingling of souls. In such moments, the state of the mouth, though rarely described in realistic terms, was essential to the image. No troubadour sang of cracked lips or stale breath. These verses floated in a world of idealized freshness where every kiss tasted of spring. The courtly ideal was one thing, the reality was another. In real encounters, in gardens or at dances, during festivals or in the shadowed corners of feasting halls, the breath could not be purely imagined. Lovers who hoped to please often took small steps to prepare. Chewing mint or parsley before meeting a sweetheart, sipping spiced wine, or holding a clove between the teeth were all quiet acts of courtship. These were not grand gestures, but they could tip the balance in a close and private moment. Among the nobility, gifts that touched on the mouth were not uncommon. A knight might present a lady with a small box of comfits or sugared almonds, both to delight her palate and to linger on her breath. A lady, in turn, might offer a scarf scented with rosemary or rosewater to be worn close to the mouth and nose. Such tokens, when exchanged, carried layers of meaning, the suggestion of closeness, the sharing of something that would flavor the breath and, by extension, the kiss. The mouth in song was not only the mouth of the beloved, it was also the mouth of the singer. Music in the Middle Ages was as much a social art as a performance, and singers, whether professional minstrels or members of a household, were judged not only on skill, but on clarity, sweetness, and control of their voice. The condition of the mouth mattered here too. A dry mouth, sore gums, or missing teeth could affect pronunciation and tone. In monastic choirs, where the voice was offered in praise, attention to the mouth took on a devotional cast. Singers might rinse with warm water before long services, or chew a mild herb to keep the throat and mouth moist. These small preparations were part of the discipline of singing, a way of honoring the text and the community through clarity of sound. Love songs and religious hymns shared this connection between the mouth and the message. In both, the mouth was the vessel of beauty, whether beauty was measured in the sweetness of a kiss or the purity of a chant. And in both, the idea of a clean mouth carried moral weight. In romances, the faithful lover's mouth was honest and sweet. In sermons, the virtuous mouth spoke truth and praise, untainted by lies or slander. Breath itself, in the language of love, was a form of intimacy. To breathe the same air as another, to feel the warmth of their words on one's skin, was to cross an invisible threshold. This is why medieval poets sometimes spoke of drinking a lover-esque breath or sharing it in the silence between words. The mingling of breath was a metaphor for union, and its sweetness was both a literal and figurative concern. In music, too, breath was the unseen partner of every note. A lute could be tuned and a harp strung, but the singer's breath was the living force that carried melody into the air. Here again, the medieval performer might turn to the same herbs and spices used in courtship, not for romance but for resonance. A sprig of hyssop to clear the throat, a sip of honeyed water to soothe it. In popular songs, though sung in taverns, fields, and marketplaces, the mouth appeared in earthier forms. Comic ballads might jest about missing teeth or foul breath, using the imperfections of the mouth to draw laughter. These songs, unbound by the polished ideals of courtly love, allowed for a kind of honesty about the everyday realities of medieval oral life. Yet even here, a bright smile or a sweet mouth could be the refrain of a flirtatious tune, reminding listeners of the mouth's place in the dance of attraction. There was also a spiritual parallel to the kiss of lovers, the kiss of peace in the Christian liturgy. This exchange, given before communion in some rites, was a sign of reconciliation and unity. In some churches, it was a literal kiss. In others, it was exchanged through an object called a poxboard, which was kissed in turn by members of the congregation. The idea was the same, the sharing of peace through the meeting of lips, and implicitly, breath. Here, the mouth's role in binding people together was elevated to a sacred plane. In all these settings, romantic, musical, spiritual, the mouth was both literal and symbolic. It was the point where the inner life met the outer world, where desire or devotion took shape in words, song, and touch. The care of the mouth, therefore, was not merely about avoiding discomfort or illness. It was about preparing for these moments of connection. A troubadour might not write of rinsing with rosemary water before serenading his lady, and a monk might not note chewing mint before the night office, but such acts were part of the unspoken preparation for their roles. To approach another in love, in song, in prayer, was to present not only oneself, but one's breath, one's voice, one's very presence. And so, in the medieval imagination, the mouth in love and song was a thing to be adorned, not with jewels, but with freshness, not with paint, but with the subtle fragrance of herbs, not with false promises, but with words that carried sweetness in both their sound and their scent. In the medieval imagination, the mouth was not only a place of nourishment, speech, and affection. It was also the vessel of truth or of lies. Words could bind a contract, swear an oath, proclaim loyalty to a lord, or just as easily commit perjury, spread slander, or incite rebellion. Because of this, the law often regarded the mouth as both a symbol and a target in the administration of justice. In a time when written documents were far from universal and literacy was limited, the spoken word carried immense legal weight. An oath taken by mouth could settle disputes over land, inheritance, or fealty. Breaking that oath was not merely a private betrayal, it was a public crime that could be punished. And sometimes the punishment fell upon the very organ that had committed the offense. One of the more symbolic forms of punishment for false speech was the pillory. Set up in a public square, the pillory clamped the offender's head and hands in place, leaving them exposed to the jeers and sometimes the missiles of the crowd. For those convicted of slander, perjury, or selling false goods, this humiliation served as both a spectacle and a warning. The mouth, silent and unable to defend itself, became the center of attention. In harsher cases, especially for repeated offenses or for crimes considered deeply dishonorable, punishments targeted the mouth directly. In some regions, a convicted perjurer might have their lips branded with a hot iron, leaving a permanent mark of their crime. Others, accused of blasphemy or spreading dangerous rumors, could suffer the loss of part of their tongue. This act was not only a physical mutilation, but a deliberate crippling of the ability to speak, a way of silencing the offender forever. Such punishments were rare enough to be remembered and feared, but common enough that chronicles and legal records preserve their details. In England in the 13th century, one man was reportedly sentenced to have his tongue cut out for speaking treason against the king. In certain German towns, false accusers could be branded on the mouth, their shame made visible to all who met them thereafter. The connection between the mouth and the law was also expressed in more ritualized forms. Swearing an oath in court often involved placing a hand upon holy relics or the Gospels and speaking the words aloud, binding oneself before God and the community. To lie in such a moment was believed to imperil not only the case at hand, but the speaker's soul. The punishment for breaking such an oath could thus be framed as a form of moral cleansing, a harsh and literal correction of the mouth. In some cases, the punishment was theatrical as well as punitive. A blasphemer might be paraded through the streets with a gag in their mouth, the device sometimes decorated or painted to draw attention. A liar might be forced to stand in public holding a sign naming their offense, a silent display that contrasted with the dangerous speech that had brought them there. These spectacles reinforced the lesson. The mouth that could harm with words could also be made powerless. The law also regulated the mouth in subtler ways. Ordinances against public drunkenness, for example, were partly about controlling speech, the slurred insults, the disorderly shouting, the rash words that could lead to fights. In guild regulations, a craftsman who spoke ill of his fellows could face fines or temporary expulsion. In markets, sellers who used false claims to promote their goods could be penalized, their credibility publicly questioned. The mouth, then, was not only the focus of punishment, but also a point of constant scrutiny. A person's reputation could rise or fall on the reliability of their speech. A merchant known for honest dealing and plain words could thrive. One suspected of deceit might find customers drifting away, even without formal accusation. There were also religious dimensions to this control. Confession, one of the sacraments of the Church, was an act entirely of the mouth. The penitent's words were the vehicle for absolution, and the priest's words, in turn, conveyed forgiveness. In this way, the mouth that had sinned could be restored through the same means, not by mutilation, but by humble speech. Yet even here, the threat of eternal punishment for unrepented lies or blasphemies hung heavy, a reminder of the mouth's double power. Public attitudes toward mouth-targeted punishments were complex. Some saw them as fitting and just a way to match the crime to its consequence. Others were uneasy, particularly when the mutilation left the offender unable to work, speak clearly, or defend themselves in future accusations. Chroniclers sometimes remarked on the cruelty of such measures, though rarely enough to suggest they were broadly condemned. In the folklore of the time, stories of punished mouths often took on moral weight. A liar might be cursed to have their tongue rot away. A gossip might find their lips magically sealed until they repented. These tales reinforced the legal principle that speech carried consequences, blending civic law with moral lesson. One of the more curious practices tied to this theme was the biting of the thumb or other gestures involving the mouth as insults. In some towns, these gestures themselves could be punishable if they were deemed provocative enough to cause a breach of the peace. Here, the law acknowledged that the mouth, even without words, could stir conflict. Ultimately, the targeting of the mouth in medieval law reflects the deep awareness of speech as a tool of power. Words could bind kings to their subjects, unite armies, seal marriages, and settle disputes. They could also destroy reputations, incite rebellion, and fracture communities. The law, in seeking to regulate the dangers of the tongue, sometimes turned to brutal measures, hoping that fear would keep lips from speaking harm. And so, in the public squares of the Middle Ages, the sight of a man in the pillory, a woman gagged for slander, or a blasphemer marked on the mouth was more than a spectacle. It was a lesson written on the body. The same mouth that could bless or curse, soothe or provoke, was a place where justice could leave its mark, ensuring that the memory of the crime traveled as far as the words once had. In the stillness that followed death in the medieval world, the mouth, which in life had spoken, eaten, sung, kissed, and prayed, became something else entirely. It was no longer the instrument of voice or breath, but a doorway between the living and the silent beyond. And like all doorways in the medieval imagination, it needed to be closed, guarded, or ritually prepared. The moment of death was often marked, among those present, by the watching of the mouth. The last breath was not merely a biological event. It was the moment the soul was thought to leave the body. Many believed it exited through the mouth, and so the parting of the lips became a symbol of departure. In households where faith guided daily life, someone might place a hand gently on the chin of the deceased, pressing upward to keep the mouth closed. This was done not only for dignity, but to prevent the soul's passage from being disturbed or re-entered by unwanted spirits. Once the body was prepared for burial, the mouth might be given special attention. In some regions, particularly in France and Italy, it was customary to place a small coin, a piece of bread, or a sprig of herbs between the lips. The coin's origin lies deep in the ancient world, a payment to Charon, the ferryman of the underworld in Greco-Roman belief. But in medieval times, it was often reframed as alms for the poor, given symbolically through the dead. Bread, too, had layers of meaning, a final offering to the soul's journey, a reminder of the bread of life in Christian teaching. Herbs were perhaps the most common addition to the mouth of the dead. Rosemary, long associated with remembrance, was placed to keep the body sweet-smelling and to serve as a token of eternal memory. In some monastic burials, the mouth was touched with holy water or wine, recalling the sacraments the deceased had received in life. Myrrh and frankincense, when available, were used in noble or royal funerals, echoing the burial of Christ as described in the Gospels. There were also more practical reasons for attending to the mouth in death. Before modern embalming, the first signs of decay often began in the soft tissues of the face. Herbs, spices, or even cloth soaked in vinegar could slow the onset of odor, particularly important when the body was to lie in state for days before burial. For high-ranking individuals whose funerals drew large crowds and long processions, these measures were part of the public image of dignity. In some parts of medieval Europe, a peculiar belief lingered that the dead could rise and speak, or worse, bite. Folklore from Eastern Europe in particular spoke of corpses that returned from the grave to harm the living, often beginning by feeding upon them. One way to prevent this was to ensure the mouth was closed tightly, sometimes even sewn shut or bound with cloth. In extreme cases, the front teeth might be broken, removed, or covered with a stone to ensure the dead could not use them. The mouth of the dead also featured in certain legal and ritual practices. In some trials by ordeal, if a person died before their testimony could be given, the mouth might be touched with a relic or a holy object, as if to seal their silence in the presence of God. Conversely, in darker traditions, there were stories of placing written oaths or accusations into the mouth of the dead, as if the corpse could carry them into the next world for judgment. For the clergy, the mouth was a focal point in the rites of death. The final sacrament given to the dying was the viaticum communion as food for the soulless journey. The host was placed on the tongue or in the mouth as one of the last acts of life. After death, the same mouth would be closed, anointed, and often covered with a shroud. In death, as in life, it was the vessel through which divine grace was received and expressed. Among the poor, customs were simpler but no less meaningful. A mother might kiss the forehead and lips of a dead child before the body was wrapped, a gesture of farewell and blessing. Neighbors might sprinkle the mouth with holy water or place a sprig of the nearest herb thyme, sage, or mint as both offering and protection. Even in humble cottages, the mouth was not left unconsidered. The treatment of the mouth also reflected the medieval understanding of the body as a whole. To prepare the dead was not merely to arrange the limbs and close the eyes. It was to restore, in some measure, the harmony and dignity of the person. The mouth, often the most expressive part of the living face, could in death appear slack, grim, or grotesque. To tend to it, to close it gently, to place something within, to veil it, was to return a measure of peace to the features. For those who kept vigil beside the body, the mouth could also stir deep emotion. In its silence, it recalled every word once spoken, every song once sung, every laugh or cry. A husband might remember the first words his wife spoke to him. A mother might recall the baby's first cries. A friend might hear again the echo of shared jokes. This emotional weight gave the mouth of the dead a kind of sacredness, fragile and untouchable. In some medieval paintings of the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, the mouth is depicted as the site of spiritual contest. Angels and demons are shown crowding near it, waiting to receive or claim the departing soul. In such imagery, the mouth is both battlefield and gate, the threshold between earthly life and eternity. Thus, the mouth in death was a place of convergence, of ancient customs and Christian rites, of practical concerns and spiritual beliefs, of grief and reverence. To close it, to guard it, to adorn it, these acts were not merely about appearance. They were part of the long tradition of acknowledging that what once spoke and tasted and breathed still held meaning, even when it no longer moved. And in this way, the medieval world's care for the mouth of the dead was an extension of its care for the mouth of the living, a recognition that in life it had been the vessel of so much of words, of love, of prayer, and that in death it deserved a final touch of respect before being surrendered to the quiet earth. This excerpt is from the book Tooth and Nail, The Strange History of Body Modifications in Medieval Europe. In the medieval imagination, the teeth, like the mouth that held them, were not merely physical tools for eating and speaking. They could be omens, treasures, weapons, or even relics of the supernatural. Stories about miraculous teeth, cursed bites, and strange dental wonders circulated in markets, monasteries, and great halls alike, passed from voice to voice until they became part of the shared fabric of belief. One of the most enduring traditions concerned the teeth of saints. The church, which preserved relics of bone, hair, and clothing, also kept teeth, often mounted in gold and displayed in reliquaries of crystal or silver. A saint's tooth might be kissed by pilgrims, touched to the lips of the sick, or dipped into water to create a healing draught. The tooth of St. Apollonia, patron saint of those suffering from toothache, was particularly prized. It was said that touching it to an aching jaw could bring relief, sometimes instantly, as if the pain had fled before her martyr's grace. The miraculous tooth did not belong only to saints. Folktales told of people born with a tooth of fortune, a small extra tooth, often in the roof of the mouth or behind the regular row, that marked them for great luck or destiny. A child with such a tooth might be predicted to become a king, a prophet, or a great warrior. In some versions, this tooth was believed to fall out at a moment of great change in the person's life, signaling a turn in fate. There were also darker versions of the tooth of wonder. In some regions, a child born with teeth, especially sharp ones, was seen with suspicion. In parts of Eastern Europe, such a child might be whispered about as destined to become a vampire or other night creature. The idea that teeth could be a sign of monstrous nature had deep roots, tied to fears about predation, disease, and the uncanny. In Western Europe, such births were rarer and often treated more cautiously, but the strangeness of a newborn already bearing teeth always drew comment. Superstitions about lost teeth were widespread. As with children's milk teeth, adult teeth pulled or fallen out were often given careful disposal. To throw a tooth into running water was thought to carry it away from harm. To bury it beneath a hearthstone could keep it safe from witches. Some feared that if a witch obtained one of your teeth, she could use it to harm you through sympathetic magic, just as she might with hair or nail clippings. This belief made the loss of a tooth a matter of quiet caution. In battle lore, the teeth were sometimes said to carry the spirit of a warrior. Tales from the Norse saga spoke of champions whose bite was as deadly as their sword, their teeth able to pierce through flesh and armor alike. In one legend, a fallen warrior's skull was kept by his comrades, the teeth set into a drinking cup as a talisman for courage. A grisly echo of the belief that teeth retained some part of their owner's power even after death. Among the peasantry, simpler superstitions prevailed. A gap between the front teeth was often called a lucky space and believed to bring fortune, especially in love or travel. The person with such a gap was thought to be charming, a good singer, or even a skilled liar, the interpretations varying by region. Missing teeth, on the other hand, could be read as a sign of hardship or bad luck, especially if lost before old age. Animals' teeth also found their place in human superstition. Wolf's teeth, in particular, were worn as amulets to ward off evil or to give the wearer the beast's strength. In some areas, the tooth of a horse was carried for protection in battle. In others, the tooth of a boar was given to infants as a teething charm, thought to ease their pain and grant them resilience. These charms often hung on cords worn around the neck or tied to clothing close to the heart. Legends of cursed bites were less common but striking when they appeared. Some told of a bite of madness, a wound inflicted by a rabid dog, which in the medieval mind was not merely a physical infection but a spiritual corruption. In certain tales, the cursed bite came from a human, a criminal or heretic whose mouth was said to carry evil. To be bitten by such a person could, in the language of folklore, mark the soul, requiring ritual cleansing as well as physical treatment. The teeth of mythical creatures were rich with symbolic power. Dragons, when slain, were sometimes said to leave behind teeth that could be planted in the earth to grow warriors. An image drawn from older classical myths and retold in medieval romances. Unicorn teeth, often narwhal tusks in reality, were ground into powder and sold as a cure for poison, their rarity and their expense making them treasures of kings. Even in more everyday superstition, the teeth played small but persistent roles. Dreams of teeth falling out were interpreted as omens of death or loss, particularly of a family member. To dream of strong, white teeth could signify good fortune ahead, while broken or bloody teeth foretold misfortune. Such dream interpretations were printed in popular dream books, sold cheaply in towns and read aloud in taverns or by the fireside. The line between superstition and medicine was often thin. A toothache might be treated with herbal pastes and rinses, but if the pain lingered, charms were sometimes whispered over the patient, calling on saints or invoking protective words. One charm from medieval England ran, Saint Apollonia, Holy Maid, keep the worm from tooth and head. By the grace of God and Mary mild, ease the pain of this poor child. It is not hard to imagine a parent speaking such words over a restless, aching child in the night, the blend of faith and folklore offering comfort where medicine could not. These beliefs, miraculous, ominous, protective, all speak to the same truth. The teeth were never seen as inert pieces of bone. They were alive in the medieval mind, holding power to bless or curse, to tell the future, to connect the living to the dead. They were tokens of identity, fragments of the self that could travel beyond the body, carrying its virtues and its dangers into the wider world. And so, whether mounted in gold in a church, hidden in the earth against witchcraft, or worn as a charm on a cord, the medieval tooth could be a thing of wonder. It could bring pilgrims to their knees, lovers to each other, warriors to courage, or enemies to fear. It could tell stories in silence, stories that, in their mingling of the sacred and the strange, remind us how deeply the people of that age saw meaning in every part of themselves, even in what the body might shed. When we look back across the centuries to the faces of the medieval world, carved in stone, painted in tempera, described in parchment-bound chronicles, the mouths we see are closed. Even in portraits of kings and queens, saints and knights, the lips are pressed together, offering only the faintest suggestion of expression. Perhaps this is why we are tempted to imagine them opening, to wonder about the teeth within, the breath behind, the words they once spoke. The story of the medieval mouth is not only one of hygiene or decay, of herbs and powders, of toothaches and barber surgeons. It is also the story of human connection, of how people met each other in speech, in song, in love, in prayer, and even in conflict. Every interaction was shaped in some small way by the state of the mouth, the scent of the breath, the clarity of the voice, the readiness of the smile. Across these 20 parts, we have walked through the gardens of herbs where mint, rosemary, and sage were plucked for cleansing. We have stood in the market squares where barber surgeons pulled teeth to the cheers and groans of crowds. We have knelt in monasteries where mouths were rinsed before chanting psalms. We have sat at the tables of kings where comfits and spiced wine sweetened the air. We have touched the relics of saints' teeth and heard the whispered charms against toothache. We have seen the mouth in its many guises, as a tool of health, as a weapon of law, as a vessel of beauty, as a frontier against disease, as a symbol in life and in death. In its simplest form, care for the mouth was an act of daily survival. For the peasant in the fields, it might be nothing more than chewing a sprig of parsley or rinsing with cool water from the well. For the merchant, it might be rubbing a powder of sage and salt on the teeth before meeting customers. For the noble, it might be sipping rosewater before speaking in council. Small acts repeated across days and years became the quiet threads that tied together the health of the mouth and the life of the person. But beyond the practical, there was meaning layered onto every gesture. In tending to the mouth, one was not only guarding against pain, but also preparing to meet the world, to speak, to sing, to kiss, to swear an oath, to confess, to command. The mouth was the meeting point between the inner self and the outer world. To neglect it was to risk more than discomfort. It was to risk how one was received by others. The medieval world understood this in its own way, even without the science we have now. They did not know of bacteria, but they knew that herbs could sweeten breath. They did not understand enamel erosion, but they knew that gritty bread could wear teeth down. They did not see sugar under a microscope, but they saw that those who ate more of it often suffered more pain. Their knowledge was imperfect, but it was practical, born from generations of observation, trial, and shared memory. And like so much else in medieval life, mouth care existed in a balance between the earthly and the spiritual. The same mouth that could speak falsehoods could also sing hymns. The same lips that might kiss a lover could also kiss a relic. The same breath that could carry disease could also carry prayer. The care of the mouth, therefore, could be framed as both physical maintenance and moral discipline. When death came, the mouth's role did not end. It was closed, anointed, sometimes filled with a final token, a sprig of rosemary, a coin, a crumb of bread. It was guarded against spirits, preserved against decay, honored as the vessel through which the last words had been spoken. Even in silence, the mouth held meaning. Perhaps this is why, when we uncover a medieval skeleton today, the teeth often catch our gaze. They are the most enduring part of the face, still white when all else has turned to dust. They carry the marks of a life lived, the wear from coarse bread, the gaps from loss, the dark hollows of old decay. Archaeologists can read these signs as clues about diet, health, and even social standing, but there is also a human reaction that is harder to name. In seeing those teeth, we see something intimate, something unchanged across time. Because our teeth, our mouths, are not so different from theirs. We chew, we speak, we kiss, we sing. We worry about our breath before a meeting or a date. We rinse, we brush, we tend to pain when it comes. We greet each other with smiles or with the careful set of lips that hides a missing tooth. In these habits and gestures, we are closer to the people of the Middle Ages than we might think. And so the last smile of this series is not a grand one. It is the quiet, human smile that comes in recognition, the moment when we realize that even across the gulf of centuries, we share the same small rituals of care, the same desire to meet the world ready, the same awareness that the mouth is both tool and emblem of who we are. It is a smile that might have followed a sip of rosemary wine in a 14th century hall, or the chewing of a mint leaf in a monastic garden, or the easing of toothache after a clove was pressed to the gum. It is a smile that, even when worn down by time, still tells a story. And if we listen carefully, we can hear that story in the silence of history, in the quiet touch of a hand closing the mouth of the dead, in the murmured blessing over a child's first lost tooth, in the rustle of herbs gathered for a powder, in the faint scent of sage and salt rising from a cloth. The medieval mouth, in all its roles, remains with us, in our words, in our songs, in our kisses, in our prayers. And though the centuries have changed our tools, our diets, and our understanding, the essential truth endures, that the mouth is not only for sustenance but for connection, and that to care for it is, in some small way, to care for our place in the world. That is the last smile, and it is not so far from ours.